My name's Nate Schwartz. I am the Director of Applied Research at the Annenberg Institute at Brown University, and I lead the Annenberg EdExchange, which might or might not be a word you're familiar with. The EdExchange consists of the three different research infrastructure initiatives run at the Annenberg Institute. So it includes Ed Working Papers, which all of you I think are familiar with, as well as Ed Instruments, our repository of measurement tools, and Ed Research for Action, that is primarily for district and state leaders that aims to synthesize research across multiple studies. So that is what we do here. We are, if you aren't signed up for email updates, you can sign up for email newsletters here. I'm just going to leave this up for a second. We have a feedback survey coming at the end of this, and we are always trying to make these better and more useful for you. So can tee that up now. No need to fill it out until the end, but we will have a feedback survey coming. And all of this matters because we continue to release resources really regularly. So all of you know about the Ed Working Papers Digest. In the next week or so, we will be releasing for Ed Research for Action. I mentioned these synthesis briefs. We'll be releasing a brief on evidence-based practices to reduce racial inequality in school discipline. And in early July, we'll be on our Ed Instruments site releasing a collection, a sort of curated collection done by a researcher of elementary science assessments. So keep your eye out for both of these. The three papers that we're focused on today, and I'm about to introduce our speakers and our participants, but the three papers are all available as, in addition to the working papers that you all have seen, we now do these policy and practice briefs that are short summaries of the papers that we feature here. And so they're policy practice briefs, these little 2-pagers about each of the studies that you're seeing here. And these, we've been told, are especially useful as teaching tools, especially useful for those of you who are looking for quick policy summaries. How this works here, and this is a behind-the-scenes view for those of you who are submitting to Ed Working Papers. You might or might not realize this. There's a whole review board of people working behind the scenes who try to put these papers, both review them, make sure they hit the quality bar that allows us to post these and feel like this is a study that, even though we're quickly posting, is ready as a working paper, and then to put these up within sort of the week or two time span that all of you are used to. So thank you again to our whole review board. And now, without anything further from me, let me introduce our speakers. So Tom D is going to facilitate this session. He's the Barnett Family Professor at Stanford University, and as a lot of you know, has done really a kind of critical body of research himself around student attendance and how that was affected by COVID, and then student attendance in this current era and how kind of immigration enforcement efforts have played out around student attendance. So he's going to be leading this conversation with a series of authors. We've got a big group today, which is great. A series of authors who have studied attendance patterns and the overlap between attendance patterns and immigration enforcement in Rhode Island and Michigan, and are working on this in other places as well. So with that as our introduction, I'm so glad to welcome Tom to the stage and to pass the mic.
Great. Thank you, Nate. And thank you to the whole Annenberg team, you and Karen and others, for organizing this and getting some great research teams together. And I'm so thrilled to not only have them, but to have such a distinguished audience. So really look forward to hearing from everyone, their thoughts and insights and questions about these issues. And given the character of the audience, I think we'll need the briefest of introductions here to motivate the topic. School attendance is widely recognized as a really important educational outcome. And in particular, chronic absenteeism was foregrounded in the wake of ESSA as states reset their school accountability systems. And interestingly, the vast majority of states lit upon chronic absenteeism, missing 10% or more of school days for any reason, as their fifth quality indicator under their refashioned accountability systems, which, as an aside, was eerily prescient of some of the challenges we're discussing now. But that recognition reflected the fact that showing up to school is the most fundamental and important aspect of behavioral engagement in schools. And both evidence and common sense underscores that it matters for both short and long run educational and economic success. So, with that antecedent, we have to acknowledge some of the challenges we faced. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, roughly 15% of US school kids were had attendance levels low enough that they were deemed chronically absent. In the 21-22 school year, as students returned pretty much universally to in-person instruction, we saw that that rate nearly doubled to close to 30%, which meant something on the order of over 6 million additional US school children were chronically absent. And that sharp increase, I mean, it was not only dramatic, but it was quite broad across different regions of the country, different subgroups of students, different school contexts. And in the subsequent years, we saw meaningful, though far from complete, improvement. I think in the most current data I've seen, I think generally schools are still 50% above their pre-pandemic baseline, somewhere around the 20 to 25% of students still chronically absent. Um, again, in the most recent data. And then ICE enforcement raids have really exacerbated that problem and virtually every other dimension of academic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, learning loss, mental health issues, enrollment loss, et cetera. So, we're fortunate to have two great research teams to, give us insights into some of the most current evidence on the effects of ICE immigration enforcement and how we're understanding responses in the field to the challenges of persistently high levels of chronic absenteeism. So the two papers rather, are first immigration enforcement and student attendance, and so which is authored by Andrew Camp, who I believe will be presenting, Jonathan Acosta, Edom Tesfa, and Janelle Hare. And the second paper, What Are Schools Doing to Improve Attendance? Evidence from Georgia and Michigan, by Jeremy Singer, who I believe will be presenting, Sarah Winchell Lenoff, Jerome Graham, and Richard Welsh. So really excited to have both, excellent research teams here to present this timely work. And what I'm going to ask is each of them to take 15 minutes to give us an overview of their research. I'll have a few questions to tee up Q&A, but then we very much want to turn to the audience and hear your questions and reactions and comments. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew to get us started on immigration enforcement and student attendance.
All right, thanks for that introduction. I'm excited to be sharing some of this research with a great group of co-authors looking at the effects of immigration enforcement in the spring of 2025. First, we'll have some table setting, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of what we do and what we find. First off, I think that there's strong reason based on prior research from Tom and many others who are in this room to expect immigration policy to have impacts on students. Those impacts tend to be negative. So some prior studies looking at immigration enforcement in the 2010s find an increase in student absences, increase in rates of exclusionary discipline, and increase in student mental health issues. Some more recent studies focused on the current regime of immigration policy have largely focused on attendance and found relatively large increases in student absences following the inauguration in 2025. There's also some evidence coming out of Florida that students' academic outcomes have been negatively harmed as well. And these large increases are perhaps not surprising given the large increase in immigration enforcement itself. So here is the weekly number of arrests from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and you can see really on day one, there was a sharp increase nationally in ICE arrests, and this largely matched campaign promises. We know that both initially and in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there were large increases in funding to enforce or to perform these actions. This was a national phenomenon. So across the country, just about every state that we have data for, we saw an increase in arrests. On net in 2025, there were about 4.5 times more arrests than in 2024. And there was also an increase in deportations of individuals with no prior criminal records. It's sort of a broad-based increase in the people being targeted and the actions themselves. When we start thinking about how immigration policy might be related to attendance, there's a few different pathways or channels that this could be occurring. You might think of material disruptions like having a caregiver detained or deported, losing employment. You can also see that there's this idea of just the general perceived risk that is nationwide, given the scope of the increase and the change in policies, that might have a chilling effect on students wanting to engage with any part of really social life, including schools. We also think about local arrests or raids. There are these events that happen in your community that might similarly have a chilling effect, might influence your perception of risk or exposure. And so in this paper, what we're really going to focus on, given that we're looking just at the spring of 2025, is the effects of this general increase in perceived risk and local arrests and raids. We're not ruling out that there could be some material disruption, but I will say in the community that we're focused on, there's a relatively small number of arrests, yet we're still finding effects on student attendance. I'll tell you a little bit more about this community, which we do keep anonymous for the purpose of focusing on the results, which we think are likely to generalize to many more settings. We refer to this community as Liberty City, and this is a post-industrial northeastern city. It has a large foreign-born population. About 40% of residents were born outside the US, majority Hispanic or Latino. And importantly, it's a very welcoming context of reception. So in our paper, we go into describe this in more details, but I think it's sufficient to say that this is a relatively good place to be an immigrant in the country. Local law enforcement vehemently opposes cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. The school district itself has quite a few policies in place to try to make this a welcoming place to be for immigrant students. We combine student by day attendance data with two sources that we think proxy or measure the scope of local immigration enforcement. The first is a ledger or record of community sourced incidents. So these are reports of both arrests, but also sightings of ICE vehicles and officers in the community. We combine that with arrest records, which are obtained via Freedom of Information Act request through the Deportation Data Project. I'll say if you're looking for data to understand the scope of the change in immigration enforcement in the country, the Deportation Data Project makes all this publicly available and quite timely. So that's a little call out because I know we have a lot of researchers on this webinar who are interested in the topic. When we think about trying to identify the causal effects of immigration policy on students, it's challenging for a few reasons. One of which, as Tom alluded to, is that attendance has been improving each year since the COVID pandemic, particularly in the community that we study. We also have some seasonality. Absences tend to be a little bit higher in the spring. You can think of this as cold and flu season, or even weather-related disruptions that make it difficult to get to school. Lastly, and I think that this is particularly salient when we think about who's going to be most affected by immigration policy, citizenship status of students or their parents are not directly observed in the data. So there's a few ways that researchers have tried to get around this limitation in the past, and it largely relies on using different proxies to identify the student groups that are going to be most vulnerable. This can be multilingual learner status or home language, although these are not without limitations themselves. For example, Puerto Rican students are a large group in the community we study, and they would probably be tagged as multilingual learners or potentially having a Spanish home language. And so it's not clear that these always identify the students who are most vulnerable to immigration enforcement. There's also in a lot of district and state data systems, this recent immigrant flag or variable. This ties back to a federal definition and is really focused on if you've immigrated in the past 3 years. And so you could think of second generation or people who may have, children who may have come here when they're quite young and then enrolled in schools in, 3 years after they've come here that would not be captured by this variable. What we use in our preferred results that I'll be sharing today is student birth location. This is a unique variable that we have access to through our partnership with the Liberty City School District. And it is what it sounds like. We see, at time of enrollment, Liberty City Schools collects data on where students were born. So we can see students that were born in the US and therefore are citizens and not subject to deportation, and students who were born outside the US who may or may not be undocumented. Our identification strategy, or how we're going to make the causal claim about what immigration enforcement has done to student attendance, relies on some persistent differences between student groups. So here I've got the 23-24 school year, and you can see that for much of the year, the rates of absences parallel each other almost perfectly. One interesting thing to note here is that students who are not born in the US actually had a lower absence rate, meaningfully lower absence rate than students who were born in the US. One thing that I just like to flag there is that indicates to me that these are students who were quite engaged in the school system. They were showing up and they were pursuing their education. When we look at the 24-25 school year, we see a similar parallel trend prior to February of 2025. But right around the end of January, beginning of February, there is a spike in absence rates for students who are not born in the US. So we use what's called a differences in differences strategy, similar to what all or most similar papers have done to try and to identify the effects of immigration enforcement on students, where we say we're going to assume that if immigration policy did not change, the rates of absences or the probability of a student being absent is going to stay parallel to this comparison group of students who are born in the US. And that difference between what we observe and what would have been expected had there not been a change in immigration policy is the effect of immigration enforcement policy. In practice, we estimate this using student and calendar day fixed effects. I won't show you the Greek and put big equations on your screen, but I'm happy to get into those in more detail if you'd like. So what we find is that students who were born outside the US were about 2 percentage points more likely to be absent following the inauguration in January of 2025. Importantly, this gets a student about a quarter of the way to being marked as chronically absent. Of course, each additional day absent is a day that a student is not in class learning. We also try to break this apart by grade level, and we see some interesting patterns here. In contrast to some other studies, we find that these effects are largest in higher grades, up to about 6 percentage points more likely to be absent on a given day in 11th grade, and not distinguishable from 0 in these lower grades. One important caveat here is that in contrast to some other settings where this has been studied, I'll note that for some idiosyncratic reasons, busing is not really provided by the district and is not particularly common in Liberty City. So that might be a factor in why we're seeing some different patterns, but that's, of course, area for future research. So we're largely finding effects that are on par with what other studies have found, if not slightly larger. But that overall effect spread just over the spring semester doesn't tell us a whole lot about how students respond in real time to local events. And to kind of highlight what I mean, consider a scenario in which we have 100 days after the inauguration for students to either be absent or present. An effect of plus 5 percentage points could be explained by 2 different scenarios. You could think of this as an additional 5% of vulnerable students absent on each day, or you could think of this as half of vulnerable students absent on 10 days. And so what we were really interested in doing, and the district was particularly interested in, was understanding how the probability of a student being absent changes when there is an event in the community. We do some modeling here that allows effects to vary around the dates of an ICE enforcement action, whether from the community source list or from the Freedom of Information Act requests. You can think of this almost as stacking an event study on top of an overall point estimate for a diff model. And so what we see is that prior to an immigration enforcement event, the probability of a student being absent is pretty similar to that overall effect. But on the day of an event and the day after, there's an increased probability of a student being absent. Now, right now, I'm showing you the community event, and this day of is marginally significant at the 90% confidence level. But when we look at timing this and in relative to the administrative records, we see that there is about a half or 3/4 of a percentage point increase in the probability of a student being absent the day after an immigration enforcement action. So this does tell us that students are responding in real time to ICE activity in their communities. That said, there's a lot that we still don't know about how immigration policy affects students. We have little evidence about what districts can do to reduce absences. And I'll note that this is an issue that was caused outside of the education system. I think that there's probably a lot of things that districts can do, and I'm excited to hear about some of these strategies. But a broader point is that we shouldn't expect schools to solve this problem on their own. We're also unable to rule out potential effects on US-born students from vulnerable populations. So US-born multilingual learners, for example, that are about half the size of the main effect that we find. I'll say that we need more studies looking at enrollment and downstream outcomes like discipline and academic achievement for these students. And this enrollment effect might be particularly large and particularly important for school districts that are already facing a crunch due to declining enrollments. A lot of our schools are funded, or most of their revenue is funded on a per pupil basis. So even a small decrease in enrollment could have huge implications for the fiscal stability of districts in the future. Just a few notes. Of course, we talk a lot more about this with appendices and all sorts of things in our paper. But we find that immigration enforcement increased absences for students born outside the US. Our results are robust to choice of treatment start date. We have a nice figure that shows it doesn't matter if you peg it to the inauguration or the first event in the community, or even earlier back to the election itself. Our results are fairly stable. It's not explained by an increase in disenrollments from the district. So potential concern might be that students are leaving the district mid-semester. We don't see that in the spring of 2025, but hopefully more results soon looking at the following of the current school year. One important note that I think is good for researchers in this literature is that our estimates using birthplace are 30 to 50% larger than other proxies. And this might indicate that those other proxies are not identifying the most vulnerable students in the same way that birthplaces. Like I say, we do find some potential evidence for spillovers on US-born students, but with focusing just on a single district, we're not really powered to detect this to the level of precision that we would like. But our big takeaway for the paper is that even in a very welcoming community where it is a good place to be an immigrant, immigration policy kept students out of school.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And I've, a number of questions and comments, and I'm sure others do as well, that we'll hold for a little bit. I did want to mention I was just really struck that you guys kept the district anonymous. I tried, unless journalists really pressed me on it, to do the same with my early study in California, simply because I was concerned about these districts that provided data possibly drawing attention to themselves and negative, repercussions, which not that long ago would have seemed like an incredibly paranoid thought, but seemed less so in the current historical moment. Okay, so let's move on to our second paper. What are schools doing to improve attendance? Evidence from Georgia and Michigan, and we'll hear from Jeremy, I believe.
Thanks, Tom, and hi, everybody. It's great to have you here. So I'm presenting evidence on behalf of myself, Sarah Lenhoff, Jerome Graham, and Richard Welch. And this comes from survey research that we did in both Michigan and Georgia. So zooming out from a specific issue that's causing absences, immigration enforcement, we're focusing a little bit more broadly on, generally speaking, how have schools been responding to the issue of absenteeism, particularly in the post-pandemic period. So absenteeism is definitely a top concern for many school and district leaders across the country. In our survey research, we found that 40%, and other research as well, found that 40% of district leaders rank attendance among top challenges that they're facing. We talked already today about how absenteeism is an issue, both because of the consequences for students and because rates of absenteeism are higher than they were pre-pandemic. And one thing that's important to know is that even though we have some research about what strategies may work, so some randomized trials or things like that, and we of course have a lot of research about the causes of absenteeism, we have a little less of a grasp on what it is that schools are taking up and actually putting in place. And this matters a lot because how schools decide to dedicate their time, their resources, and personnel matters a lot. So this is an attempt to really lay the foundation, give us a good understanding of how schools and districts have been responding to the issue. And just to let you know too, that what I'm presenting today is part one of multiple phases of analysis in this line of research, both for our team in Michigan and Richard and Jerome's team that's focused on Georgia. So today I'll be presenting some of the evidence on what practices are schools and school leaders reporting, but we're also taking further steps both through additional quantitative analyses and with focused case studies to understand what strategies out of those that they report are really making a difference and what does it look like to implement them well. So a little background on our study, we had a total of about 1,500 survey responses from both Michigan and Georgia. And this was really beneficial because instead of just zooming in on a single state, this allowed us to really think about whether the strategies that are reported as common in one state are also common in another state. And we asked about 29 different individual strategies that schools might be using. And we sent that survey to principals to respond. And as I mentioned, it's a really useful opportunity to compare these different contexts, in part because Georgia and Michigan have slightly different policy environments. And in particular, I want to mention that Georgia has a bill that requires schools that have a certain attendance or absence level to implement attendance teams, whereas Michigan doesn't have those kinds of requirements, but has invested heavily in some other areas like student well-being and mental health. And just to frame our study, before talking about the results, the framework that we used was essentially grouping these strategies into three major categories. And this is kind of rough, it's hard to always say that one of these is definitely only in one category and not another. But this is hopefully just to give you a sense of how we've been thinking about the different tools that are available to schools and districts. So one general group of strategies is about changing behaviors. So that includes sending letters, making phone calls, using things like text messages, and then also stronger incentives, positive strategies, or negative incentives like court referrals or truancy court mandates. And then the second category is removing barriers to attendance. So this would be a heavier lift for schools. It would be things like providing transportation, supporting families with housing or homelessness, providing or connecting to social services, mental health support, and more intensive strategies like family engagement and home visits. And then the third bucket would be more generally improving students' experiences. So that would be things that focus on improving teaching or relationships or school climate more broadly. It could also include adjusting to accommodate students. So not necessarily changing their experiences in the school, but things like changing their schedules or providing alternative learning avenues for them. We kind of lump those in that bucket as well. And what I'm sharing here is not based on a formal cost benefit analysis, so it's not precise per se, but conceptually speaking, we think of these things as on a spectrum of cost and effectiveness. And this graphic is really meant to communicate that, generally speaking, we don't really think there are silver bullets. Some of our follow-up work is helping to kind of validate that point, but there are things that are easier and harder for schools to do that are more or less in schools' wheelhouses, and the things that are potentially more impactful, especially like removing barriers directly, are also expensive and more difficult for schools to enact. Whereas efforts to change student or parent behavior using communication or incentives of some form, they may be easier and less costly to implement, but they are also more modest in their impacts based on some of the research that we've read. Improving student experiences kind of in the middle somewhere, and it's worth noting that that can tend to align with other strategies that schools are already using. So schools are often already focused on improving instruction or improving school climate. So it doesn't have to be necessarily a separate initiative. And just to summarize the overall findings here before I share a few more details, we found striking similarities between what principals in Michigan and Georgia reported to us, which was really interesting and suggests that there's kind of a common blend of strategies that schools are coming up with as they're thinking about approaching these things. And some of the strategies that were most typical in one state were also most typical in another. That said, we did find a few key differences between the states. So when we found those, they really stood out because they seem to be aligned with what we know about how these states differ in terms of their policies, and I'll dig into that. And then last, we looked at variation across geography, across prior absenteeism rates. We incorporated income status of students and racial demographics, and we found very little variation within each state across these contexts, meaning that the similarities that we found were both similar between Michigan and Georgia and similar in different areas of the same states. So quickly to tick through the specifics here, we found on average that principals out of that 29 possible practices, principals tended to report using about 12 of those. And that was strikingly similar in both states. And of course, there's variations. So some may have reported only 8, some may have reported, selected 16 or 18 of those, but the average amounts were similar between two states. And the mix of strategies was also similar. So you can see that in the bar chart here that around half of strategies principals reported fall into that parent or student behavior bucket. Around a third fell into that removing barriers, and around 15% fell into that improving student experiences bucket. So again, really showing some similarities across contexts. The most common strategies, as I just mentioned, are related to communicating with families and other efforts to address student or parent behavior in some way or another. And you can see here, while the exact percentages differ between Michigan and Georgia for a bunch of these, the order that they're ranked, or in other words, the ones that were most versus least prominent, are pretty similar across all of these individual items. So for example, sending letters home, like a standardized attendance letter, talking about the importance of attendance, making personalized or automated phone calls home. These were some of the most common things that we saw. I want to make a note quickly that things like text messaging were kind of lower on the list. I raised that because some of you may be familiar with research that suggests that smaller text nudges are relatively effective. And it was interesting to see that phone calls and letters, which are more traditional forms of communication, seem to have staying power compared to more modern forms of communication like texting. So a few differences between the states. One that really stood out was related to what we know about Michigan, which is that there's been a really big push over the last several years at the state level to emphasize social emotional learning, to promote restorative practices in response to discipline and improving school climate, and to address student mental health. So here you can see that principals in Michigan were much more likely to report these two strategies compared to principals in Georgia. Whereas otherwise, strategies related to addressing student experiences were relatively similar. And then also you can see mental health support, similar to the trend we were just discussing, was more common in Michigan than in Georgia, whereas other strategies that are related to addressing barriers had relatively similar responses across the contexts. And then last thing here, we also asked about 6 organizational systems that might be in place for schools to address attendance. So not specific strategies, but systems or routines or other organizational forms of coordination to help guide their work or analyze data. And 2 things that really stood out to us were that attendance teams in particular, also early warning systems, were more common in Georgia. And this we've we think is likely related to the fact that attendance teams are a policy mandated strategy for schools if they are above a certain threshold of absenteeism. So again, speaking to the idea that the policy environment does seem to influence the strategies or the organizational approaches that schools take up. And going to our last research question, as I said, we did a regression analysis and included a bunch of contextual variables to try and identify whether the specific mix of strategies that schools use differs across different areas within the same states. What you're seeing here, the R squared values essentially represent how much variation across schools could be explained by all those contextual variables. And we found overall very small R squared values, which suggests very little of the variation is explained by these things. In other words, suggesting that why two schools might be doing something different in the same state is a lot less about the students that they're serving or the context where they're located, and more about other idiosyncratic factors like the decisions of the school or district leaders. There were a few things that seemed to matter. Higher absenteeism schools were places where principals were a bit more likely to rank attendance as a top focus. Makes sense. Also, high schools were more likely to have principals who said attendance was a priority and also focused on strategies that tried to improve student experiences. So high schools are a place where this is an even greater emphasis to some extent than elementary schools. And we also mentioned earlier the state context. So it does seem like there were a few specific areas where the state policy context mattered to differentiate what schools are doing. But otherwise, we found great similarity both within and across the states. So just to quickly summarize, we mentioned communication is one of the most common strategies and others that target parent and student behavior. We think this is natural because these are the kinds of things that are within reach for schools. So it's worth thinking not just about whether you are doing those things well, but are you using the right strategies when it comes to communication? And then how can you bring other strategies that might work when it comes to improving student experiences and addressing barriers into the mix as well? And then we do think there is some evidence here that policy is shaping some of the specific practices that schools are adopting. But more broadly, there's a really striking uniformity both within and across states, which suggests that schools are kind of responding to a common set of potential strategies, whether that's because of what they're learning from the guidance that they're hearing from their districts, from their states, from national conversations, or maybe it's because there are just natural ways that schools tend to address certain kinds of problems that are more common than others. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it back to Tom.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to both teams for producing this timely research. So I will kick off our discussion turning back to the first paper, and then look forward to broadening the discussion. So first for Andrew and his team, I mean, I'm so glad you're doing this work. I think education data, I mean, it's not only an important context for understanding ICE effects, but for understanding the experiences of undocumented residents more broadly. There's a lot of research on undocumented residents outside of education that has trouble even tracking, these community members in the data. And they've tried to do things like use survey data and impute undocumented status. And I've felt and argued that education data, I mean, the education context is not only useful, the data are uniquely relevant because of their timeliness and universality in providing information on the social experiences of undocumented residents. And I think your work pushes that forward by using country of birth. But I did want to probe what I think a potential caveat relevant to that, which is, it's my understanding that a lot of students who are vulnerable not because they're undocumented. They're in fact younger students who are born here, but rather have household members who are undocumented, parents, caregivers, etc. And that's why in the attendance analysis I did in California, I actually found the attendance or the increase in absences was particularly large among young kids, which is I viewed as consistent with the idea that parents with really young kids were uniquely concerned about being separated from them. And you've got this more exacting measure of, birth status but those kids, and you're finding effects among older kids, but that may be because older students who are in our schools are more likely maybe to have moved here when they were in middle school. So, if anything, to my mind, this makes me think your results are giving us a kind of lower bound on some of the broader effects of immigration enforcement, given the very exacting way in which you're measuring vulnerable status. So I wanted to offer that as kind of a question slash comment and see if you have any reactions.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that that our results are lower bound for multiple reasons. One of which people who maybe don't even have undocumented person living in their house might still be affected by these policies for a variety of reasons. Concerns about maybe the enforcement actions themselves not truly being targeted at undocumented people, which of course would affect our comparison group. I think that I'll do two things. One, your comment is almost identical to one that we've gotten from a reviewer. Maybe you're a reviewer too, in which case,
I
nice
am
to have you
not.
here.
I am now and never a reviewer too.
Okay. Yeah, well, I didn't mean it in it. Yeah. And so one thing that we've done through our partnership with Liberty City school districts is we now have student home addresses. So we're going to expand our analysis. Of course, we can see if another student in that household was born outside the US, which would capture some of what you're talking about. We don't have parental status, so we won't be able to fully investigate this dynamic. But two, I think one thing that your comment highlights is that we should probably expect almost a distribution of effects based on your vulnerability. We think that students born outside the US or with another child in the household that was born outside the US are the most vulnerable. But there's also, like we're unable to rule out spillover effects on US born students who, by definition, are not deportable. And so I think it's good to keep that in mind, and I appreciate the comment.
Thank you. And I think, another question that I know I've been sitting with for a while, and I'm curious, and you may not have an answer to this, but in the wake of all the tumult in Minnesota, we've largely seen immigration raids, fall out of extensive news coverage. But I wonder, has the character of immigration enforcement changed? I mean, you mentioned the timely FOIA data that's part of the Berkeley Deportation Data Project. I'm curious, have you had a chance to look at that? Has there been a change in the intensity and breadth of immigration enforcement in recent months?
And I'll just jump in real quick. And one of the other, I think, almost caveats that we want to add, and that when we were writing the paper, we wanted to be clear about this. Where your work looked at raids, our work was looking at single targeted arrests and still identifying these pretty significant effects. And so part of what we were arguing was that immigration enforcement actions, almost regardless of their breadth, can and are still very disruptive. In the log that we were keeping with some local stakeholders, we were actually also able to use the presence of an ICE vehicle. So there were a couple days across the study period where it was reported that there was an ICE vehicle parked maybe a block and a half away from the local high school, the one local high school in the Liberty City School District. And even that, we saw the effects. Now, one small thing I want to add in when we're talking about the differential effects, and one hypothesis that we've been exploring in our collaboration with the district is how quick information flows travel. And so in the district, as we were tracking incidents, the acute effect was on the day of the arrest. So the information was traveling faster than the district was able to respond. And one of the things that we've been talking about is, who has access to what information. And so if high school students all have cell phones and they're getting, social media posts about a car parked outside, a block away from the high school, or somebody getting arrested on the main street of the community, they might be responding quicker than younger students or than families that aren't as active on their phones. And that's one of the things that we've been trying to collaborate with the district on thinking through and how they might be able to respond to that.
Yeah, and just to circle back, the point that you made, I think, was really important, Tom, that there's been this attention that seems to have dropped off. I'm thinking particularly of Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which obviously got a lot of attention. That was a small share of the total arrests during that period. And so while there's not this media awareness, we only have data going through the beginning of March. I imagine we'll get more data soon from the Deportation Data Project. I think that the level is still quite high. It's still, from my read, 4-ish times the pre-inauguration level of arrests. So I'm not sure that they've actually fallen much.
Great, thank you. So let me turn to Jeremy and his team. I mean, they're really two broad things about first of all, I applaud the original data collection. I mean, really ambitious and timely effort. So it's much appreciated. Now, you find that there are these quite striking and broad cross-state differences. I guess there's like two parts to this question. I'd love to hear you unpackage. One is, what do you think is the character or what are the underlying determinants of these broad state level differences? And I think it's particularly relevant since, I mean, one of the most surprising and enigmatic things in your study is the uniformity of the ways in which schools are addressing attendance challenges within states. My priors would have been that there's an incredible amount of local heterogeneity in terms of the barriers to school attendance and correspondingly how schools might respond. You know, transportation issues or school safety issues or instructional quality issues, et cetera. I would think within states would have incredible variation. So I would love both, again, to know how do you think about the cross-state differences and how do you think about this enigma of within state uniformity in what schools are doing? Is it that there are differences in context and the schools just aren't being responsive to it? Or are we wrong to think there's that degree of, or am I wrong to think there's that degree of local heterogeneity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me take the first part and then I'll defer to my colleagues, especially maybe Richard wants to chime in on how we understand state policy and state differences. But, you know, in both states, we saw great similarities. Again, a lot of the same stuff happening between both states and a lot of the same stuff happening in different areas. So you might be thinking a rural context and an urban context, you might expect to see different strategies or different responses. I think if you pose that question to organizational researchers, people who study the nature of schools and education systems and how they function, they would probably respond that that's not a surprising finding at all, because what we know about other functions in schools is that the way that schools do things tends to look strikingly similar everywhere, from the way that we organize our curricula to the way that teachers organize their lessons and provide instruction. And so I think there's just a general rule that like schools, like other institutions in our society, tend toward similar approaches to one another. It's a way of establishing legitimacy. It's a sort of social law of how organizations and leaders tend towards figuring out strategies, and they kind of land on similar approaches. And then I guess I would add that I do think that there must be some good reasons to differentiate what you're doing based on your local context, but it also may be the case that the way that school leaders understand the underlying causes of absenteeism kind of leads them to taking a sort of all of the above approach. Like it's a very complicated issue, and for any given school, even if the specific context differs from another place in another area of a state, the reasons that any of their individual students are missing school are going to be very varied and complicated. And so what we think might be happening is there's sort of a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And that's why you start getting something looking similar in different places, because everyone's doing a bit of everything. Let me just pause there and say, yeah, we did mention there's a few specific state differences that we think might be related to state policy. I don't know if Richard, did you want to chime in and share anything about that and some of your other work in that area?
Yeah, I think you got most of it, but I think we're finding that the Georgia principals are using more attendance team and more MTSS. I think it is partly attributed to SB 123, which is a policy that came down last year, which essentially said no expulsions for absenteeism, mandated attendance review teams, and sort of more of an emphasis on intervention plans. I think if we look at the two states post-pandemic, I think Georgia has passed legislation. I'm not sure Michigan has. Georgia is part of the 50% challenge. I don't think Michigan is part. But I think some of the differences we're observing is maybe them kind of deepening their pre-pandemic focus. So what you mentioned earlier, Jeremy, about Michigan with their investments in restorative justice, SEL. Georgia, I think has been a PBI state, so I think it wasn't surprising that I saw Georgia were using attendance incentives more. So it's interesting to me as I hear our discussion that both states kind of have this, this feeling of doing what they have been doing before, or maybe what they've been doing well. Maybe this overlap between discipline and attendance. And then probably the final thing is that I think even if districts and schools were innovating, one of the channels where these innovations would spread would be probably local resource, local coming together of districts. So it's not super surprising to me that districts nearby might be copying what they see other districts doing, what might be successful in their approach to improving attendance.
That's great. Thank you. And yeah, there's lots of things I want to follow up on, but let me also, I was really struck by what you guys described as your phase two plan to study the impact of different policies. And part of my motivation here is my sense of the evidence base on what works in promoting school attendance is that it's just not where it should be in terms of giving us really strong, actionable guidance from high quality research designs. So I would love to hear just maybe a little bit about what we might expect from you in the near future, and excited that you're going to be addressing, uh, that absence in the literature.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me share what we're doing in Michigan and what I'll let Jerome and Richard talk a little about what they've already been doing in Georgia. But maybe Curran can share the link. So we released a recent report where we built on these findings in Michigan. And what we did was, and let me just say, Tom, so I guess the distinction here is the evidence that we do have is from things like randomized trials or, in some fortunate circumstances, maybe a quasi-experimental study of an initiative like having free breakfast available, but it's only in some schools based on a cutoff or something, right? So we do have some of that kind of evaluation work. And then I guess I would characterize our research body as complementing that as being a little bit more ground up as opposed to top down, where we're starting with this basis of evidence of asking what schools are doing, and we're trying to figure out and parse how much we can, however much we can about what's working there. So we used like a value added approach. Value added modeling is really common in research on effects of teachers or schools on instruction. And so we've adopted that for attendance. There's a few other folks who have used that. And we combine that with our survey data. So not enough time at the moment because I want to make sure there's time for others to chime in to speak to some of the findings there, but there's a link there. But that's one way that we're approaching this is sort of looking at the correlation between a school's value added estimate and these various strategies that they have in place. And I know Richard and Jerome are doing something similar with like these outlier or positive outlier analyses. And then we're also, both of our teams are planning on qualitative work. Jerome and Richard have made some more progress than we have so far on the qualitative work, which is really helpful, kind of taking these positive outlier cases and more average cases. And with this comparative design, it gives you a better sense not only of what's in place, but the nitty-gritty of implementation, the coordination and organizational supports that are necessary. Jerome, did you want to chime in and share anything, some initial stuff from the qualitative work you've had in Georgia so far?
Sure. Briefly, and then Richard, if we have time, feel free to chime in. But I can say one of the most insightful findings that we have so far relate to those attendance teams that were mandated in the state law that Richard mentioned earlier. And what we find when we look at these, outlier settings versus, not outlier settings is that they are generally doing a lot of the same things. And so I think that provides some validation for the survey results that we find. where it's not like some magical thing that we can point to and say, oh, this is the thing likely to be leading, this school to receive or achieve its outlier status. But what seems notable between those that we've identified as positive outliers and not is to what extent the things that they are doing are aligned and coordinated. And so we'll find that, for instance, in a school with, really high absenteeism, they have an attendance team, but they might not, meet as regularly. It's much more difficult for them to kind of identify and track kids. And some of that is just capacity related. If you have a list of 50 kids, in a team of 5 people, you can kind of divide that really evenly. And every time that kid misses a day, our kind of positive outlier settings talk about how we reach out immediately. We can visit the homes. We can do all these things. But that's just much harder to do when your caseload is, 300 chronically absent students. And so some of it is capacity related, but we find that the coordination and the implementation with fidelity of those attendance teams seems to be something surfacing in the data as really important. Um, and that kind of continues to come up over and over again. So I know that we want to get to other questions. Richard, if you have anything, feel free to chime in. But that's one of the most insightful findings that we've done so far in the qualitative work.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I want to sort of plus one on the idea that you're beginning with some of the local innovations and studying those. I think there's an appeal to that, but I'm also struck by the your observation that the uniformity of district responses within states might reflect the way schools don't really, they're mimicking what their peers do and the guidance from the state, and they're not necessarily engaging with the very local context of their challenges at scale. And so this just reminds me of some of the challenges we have with implementing continuous improvement in the US, in US schools in particular. There's a common sense logic to having grounded frontline educators identify local problems and pilot solutions tailored to those very local problems. But we often fail to implement that well. I'll share, I recently wrote about this in an essay I should probably send somewhere for publication that I'll share in the chat. And I think, so what I'm seeing in some of your results, it reminds me of what I landed on in this essay, which is if we want schools to do continuous improvement, we need to create supports and environments that help them do so. So that means training and resources so they can have a team leader. That means data systems so they can engage in inquiry cycles in real time. And that means an institutional commitment to that kind of change process that lasts longer than the superintendent who's going to be gone in 2 or 3 years. Because and often those initiatives live at the level of the superintendent and not with the frontline educators. And so they never really take. They fail not just in education, but often in business and health as well. So anyway, I wanted to share that observation. And I'll make one more observation before I turn to Karen and some of the audience questions. I did want to offer maybe like a friendly amendment to how you are characterizing some of the research literature on what we know about promoting school attendance. The notion that there are no silver bullets in education or in any policy domain is generally a good rule of thumb. I think that's broadly true. But I do want to suggest that perhaps the closest thing to a silver bullet in education exists in this space. And that involves these carefully designed text messaging programs and other forms of outreach using postcards, et cetera. There are several large-scale randomized trials that have found what I would characterize as fairly large effects in promoting attendance from real-time attendance monitoring coupled with messaging to parents. And the aspect of the message, the design of it can really matter. I noted that the least common form of communication from your survey data were more personalized text messages. But that more personalized engagement, I think, is exactly what some of this literature suggests is effective, so-called psychologically wise design features that aren't just bureaucratic, but underscore warmth and capacity and shared goals, etc. And I think this matters too because it's low cost and highly scalable. Those are design features that are lamentably rare. And I would offer that some of what I've seen with other education interventions, where studies will report large effects, are based on more suspect research designs, things that would fall squarely within tier three of ESSA evidence tiers. So, teacher home visits is one example. Um, and also just much more expensive and hard to implement with fidelity at scale. So I still think we have a lot to learn in this space, and I think the ground up approach you're taking is a sensible one. But yeah, I think that's my sense of the state of the literature. So let me pause there. Give anyone on the research teams a chance to respond if they'd like to, or we can turn to audience questions.
If I can add something very quickly, to
Please.
your point about personalized text messages and personalized communication with families, I think one of the big interventions that schools can make here is to have multilingual family engagement staff who can, among other things, implement these personalized messages in places that families are actually using on their phones. Namely, WhatsApp is a really big platform that a lot of immigrant and multilingual families are using much more than US citizen English only families are using. In my experience as a family engagement specialist, working with predominantly Spanish speaking families, a lot of my time was spent talking to families over WhatsApp to ensure that they had the information that they needed about their school. I think that family engagement specialists can also be a big help in doing home visits because they are intimately aware of the cultural sensitivities and nuances that immigrant families have that US families, culturally are different from. And so one of the big recommendations that I have overall, not just in relation to immigration enforcement, but family engagement and trust in the school writ large, is to have multilingual staff working in the schools and district to support these families.
That's such a great point. Thank you for sharing it. And to add on to it, I think that cultural fluency is important, but also we should be mindful too that a text messaging study that showed high impact from text messaging in 2018 might not tell us about the impact of text messaging in 2026. I think there are some reasons to be concerned that people, even when well designed, may be a little more numb to that. As a more general commentary, that's why I sometimes like to call the what works clearinghouse the what has worked clearinghouse. It's not necessarily the what will work clearinghouse. Um, with that note, though, let me turn to Karen, and I'd love to hear from this questions from this incredible audience. And I think we've had some submitted early we can queue up.
Thanks, Tom. So now we're going to turn this into a broader discussion. If you're comfortable turning on your video, I think that would make it a really nice atmosphere for those who are going to come on video from the audience and ask their questions. So I'll turn it over to our first pre-submitted question, but as for doing that, now is a great time to continue using the chat, write in the chat your questions for the speakers, the authors, for Tom, and we will start. If you are ready, Michael, could you share your question? Michael from University of Maryland.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Karen. Really interesting studies. Great job, guys, and teams. The question I had queued up, that I expect that Jeremy might think I would take it to this place. I'm well known to think about what the implications are for a classroom anytime we think about a higher level or policy consideration. So I'd just love to hear from both teams, even though it's not the, focus of the study. So you might not have data to speak to that, especially in the qualitative work that the folks working with the Georgia schools. I'd love to hear like what implications do you think this attendance loss and maybe even the peer effects of that have for teaching and learning, like actual like the classroom environments here. So, we might think about the broad effects of the 1.5 years of school interruption that we had from COVID, 1 to 2 years of interruption, and the knockoff effects of that on at least achievement, if not other things that we've missed out on measuring. I'd imagine this has, especially in the places with the ramped up ICE enforcement, the possibility to have just as disastrous, if not worse, effects on the like what can happen in classrooms. So I'd love to hear from both teams a little bit about just how do you think about what those implications are and what they might actually mean for school leaders or even teachers in classrooms and what they can do to help.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to offer my thoughts quickly. The first of which is, Michael, I think you have the best background I've seen on Zoom, at least in the last few years. Just beautiful. I think that the issue you're raising is really important to think about, and we hope to continue looking into this academic effects and maybe get at some of the effects of pure absences on non-absent students. One of the biggest challenges I had when I was teaching was it would be a different set of students absent every day. And so catching everybody up, keeping pace is a real challenge for teachers. I think that, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the mural information, which I'll have to look at. But I think that one implication, and this is a potentially unpopular opinion, is that if this is an ongoing threat to student attendance, and you have these students who were highly engaged in the past, is that districts might want to consider thinking about how virtual learning, although it is not substitute, could be used to offset potential negative academic impacts.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly to say one of the things I've worried about in this context is, first of all, the direct effect on teachers of just having to see their students going through these environments can contribute to teacher burnout, which we already know is quite high. But second, I think there are mechanisms in the classroom by which ICE enforcement activities can have negative spillover effects, even for students not directly affected by the activity. First of all, they're seeing their peers and friends going through stuff. But think of the teacher trying to manage instructional differentiation and instructional pacing in a classroom where students are missing a lot of class, showing up with different kinds of trauma and issues. So the challenges of teachers trying to manage that, I think, could have serious instructional and achievement implications more broadly.
I just wanted to add, so when you zoom out to the broader conversation about strategies for attendance, I do think that thinking about the classroom is a really good idea. And I think there's a really tricky balance where wanting to improve attendance is yet another thing that we may be putting on teachers. But I do think there's good evidence that teachers can make a big difference from prior and forthcoming work on teachers' effects on student attendance. So I think one of the important things to stress is that one of the ways that teachers improve student attendance is by doing the things that teachers do very well, right? Having a positive learning environment, students feeling challenged, supported, and so on. There may be some extras like making sure teachers are proactive in monitoring and reaching out about attendance. I know that when I was a classroom teacher, attendance was very much on the back of my mind compared to some of the other things I was juggling. So there's definitely room to sort of improve what teachers are doing there. But it's also a good reminder for teachers and then for schools more generally that focusing on the fundamentals, improving the student experience when it comes to learning, belonging, relationships, and so on is just as important as these various discrete initiatives that our team has tried to highlight.
Are we ready to move on to the next question?
I think so.
All right, I'm going to give voice to this one since John had to leave early. This is John Sludden from NYU. And he asked, do you have a sense of the political responses at the local, meaning boards or the mayor, and state levels? Does it vary by state? I think we talked already about variation by state, but I did think looking at it by local versus state level might be interesting, and I don't think that's been talked about yet.
I mean, I'll start just by saying that in the local context that we looked at, we've been framing it in part as this is a best case scenario, and still we see these negative effects, right? And to add some flavor to what we mean by best case scenario, this is a school district that has a safe schools policy that is pretty strict about what information can and would be shared with federal authorities. It's pretty strict about who can be allowed onto a school campus. It includes consequences for any school affiliated staff or employee that shares information about students. This district, relative to the broader state, has 4 times a greater share of its teacher force that is identifies as Hispanic or Latino. And so, we've really kind of ramped up how we talk about this as a welcoming context of reception, and it's still, very negative impacts from these activities. So one thing that I kind of wanted to note, and there were questions about family engagement teams earlier and funding and things like that, and we don't include this in the paper, and we wouldn't expect it to kind of hold up to academic muster. But one of the things that we try to do in collaboration with the district, having had half a year of observed behavior around attendance, was to work with the district to try to create a almost like a vulnerability scale and communicate that to the district so that in an under-resourced, challenging environment, they could be strategic about which families they were going to reach out to. And so it was the variables that we had used in the paper, but also adding the observed behavior of students who were absent either on the day of or following an immigration enforcement action, and communicating that to school leaders and to their family engagement teams to say, these are some of the folks that you should start talking to. And one thing I want to add to that is just we recognize that this is dynamic, that not just in the way that Tom was saying of, what worked in 2018 might not work in 26, but also what we're seeing the federal government do in 26 might not be what we see them do in 27. So one of the things that we know about this community is that so far these have been arrest warrant based activities. So it's single targets, not raids, not large scale raids. That could change. We had hundreds of millions of dollars appropriated towards essentially like growing the carceral state apparatus in this country. And so if that changes, the district is going to have to be prepared to change its response as well. And so it's a very dynamic situation that we're kind of watching and trying to support the district in navigating.
Thank you, Jonathan. So maybe we can move on to the next question, Karen.
Sure thing. So this will come from Ashley Rojas. Ashley, could you introduce yourself, say what you do, where you work, and then ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Ashley Rojas. I'm a fifth-year economics PhD candidate at the University of South Carolina, and I work on immigration policy. And my question kind of was already answered. We had the conversation about, this access to information, what new methods they're using to try to, get at parents more to understand what's going on. But someone mentioned, WhatsApp being a primary way that a lot of these families speak to each other. So I guess my question is more of what are schools doing to increase that information access for non-English speaking parents?
If it's all right, I'd like to jump in and answer this question. So, the district that we partnered with, Liberty City Schools, has a team of multilingual family engagement staff who they work with families from the minute that they enroll. So they're in charge of the process of enrolling newcomer families into the district. So families, once they come into the district, they already know that there are people here employed by the district that are meant to support them throughout their children's educational journey. In other districts that I've worked in, they have contracted with mass texting, automated text tools that automatically translate messages and that integrate with WhatsApp so that families don't have to learn how to use another app and navigate that system all over again. The district also has partnerships with community-based organizations that support immigrant families, such as legal aid and mutual aid organizations and food pantries, to make sure that if there's an interruption in a family, in a caregiver's work situation, that they still have access to their basic material needs. One other recommendation that I can give to any district with a large proportion of immigrant students and families is to consider how parent-teacher organizations are accessible to families. Offering interpretation, food, and childcare are really straightforward ways to reduce the barriers to engagement for these families. Too often, PTOs are predominantly English speaking and higher income, and so that environment really limits the diversity of voices that can be heard in those groups and the extent to which information is spread among parents. And so I really, really encourage districts to consider how their PTOs can be more inclusive of families with different economic and linguistic needs. I also recommend that school districts engage with specific parents in the school community with high intra-community social capital. So maybe there are parents who are leaders of religious or diaspora groups or who are business owners. Communicating through them and leveraging their social capital, their networks, and their trustworthiness to communicate with the broader community can be another way to build families' sense of safety and trust in the school, not just in the context of ICE activity, but more generally in terms of school and community communication, given the power and language gaps present between the school and immigrant families.
Great, thank you. Karen, did you want to go to another one of our audience questions? And then maybe, I know we're going to run out of time fairly soon. I would love to create some space for those who are here and maybe didn't get a chance to submit a question to ask a question
Yeah,
if they'd like.
absolutely. Let's do one from Stacy, which was pre-submitted, but I know Stacy is here, and then we want to hear from people who did not pre-submit, which is a new word that I made up. So, Stacy Pellica, could you share who you are, where you work, what you do, and what your question is?
Sure. My name is Stacy Pellick. I'm the Director of Research at the National Education Association. And as folks who have been reading the chat know, I'm also in my spare time working on documenting the work or documenting the impact of Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota. My question is broader than that, though. I'm interested. I know that attendance is a really effective measure because we can connect it to a lot of other potential outcomes. So access to school meals, access to student mental health services, access to a school nurse, and so on. And thinking that through, it strikes me that in the context we're talking about, those needs are even greater. So thinking about something like Minnesota, people were unable to leave their homes to go to the grocery store. So that, increases the need for nutrition services even more. You have, students whose parents are being taken away from them, and thus need more access to student mental health. And at that exact same moment, they are less likely to be attending school. So while I know that we have existing research to connect attendance to some of those outcomes, I'm wondering if there have been any efforts or thoughts put towards looking at in this specific context.
Yeah, I can take a quick start crack and then other folks can jump in. I'll just start by saying, and my economist friends might get mad at me because of the issues with causation. I think the current moment that we're in makes making a causal argument even harder than it already usually is. And what I mean by that is, like, by October, there are thousands of people in most states that are going to get kicked off of SNAP, right? So when we think about, and it's same thing with healthcare, right? And so, it's going to be hard to make a direct link between, you're not going to school maybe because of an immigration enforcement action, and then, either food insecurity or a lack of access to healthcare and so on. That said, when we first started this partnership with the Liberty City School District, one of the first things that the board asked us to do was, can we look at longer term effects, and in particular, because of our focus on academic achievement, can you look at standardized test scores? And so, our response, and my gut response to Michael before when Andrew answered, was like, we don't know yet. but we're going to keep looking, right? And so we have a multi-year partnership with the district, and we have some baseline data for students who are, in third grade or who are already taking access tests for their MLL levels from before. And so we're going to be following them over time to see how this happens. We also have, looking at previous research like Heinrich et al.'s work from 22 from Trump 1.0, the behavior effects didn't really show up till about a year after the rates, right? And so we know that some of this stuff takes time, and that's why, we feel very fortunate and want to continue to collaborate as good collaborators with this school district and see what happens. But some of that stuff we just don't quite know yet. We do have a lot of data from the district, and we're going to continue to follow them over time.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think broadly speaking, it's a good point that we tend to focus on attendance because attendance has a demonstrated relationship with test scores, with persistence and graduation, with college enrollment. But I think your question, Stacy, raises the point that schools do so much more for students, socially, emotionally, civically, and it's worth considering making those connections direct as well, and including helping students meet basic needs like access to meals or healthcare, something that might be co-located. So yeah, I really appreciate you raising that point, and it's a good reminder for all of us who focus on attendance to keep in mind the many ways that missing school could negatively impact students.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you both. Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, who from the audience wants to jump in? You don't have to be pre-approved. You can just come off mute and ask your question.
Hi, I have a question. My name is Kate Barnes. I hope you guys can hear me, but I am a postdoc at Texas A&M. I was curious about the two studies we heard from. Could you guys talk a little bit about what the transportation systems look like in the districts that you were studying as well? Just kind of piggybacking off of that, like there's a lot of other systems that impact public education and vice versa. So I was just curious about that.
I'll just say quick, in the district that we're looking at, Andrew mentioned this before, there's very little busing. So almost everyone is either walking to school or dropped off by a parent. Busing really is just reserved for students who have an IEP, an individualized education plan, and so it's less of a factor in this context.
And since we did statewide studies, we didn't dive as deep as individual districts' transportation policies and resources, but we did ask on the survey how do you and how often do you arrange transportation for students? And that can mean a bunch of stuff, right? So the maybe half of principals who said, yes, that is a tool in our toolkit when it comes to attendance. Maybe that means getting them on the bus. Maybe that means providing gas cards to families to help make driving more affordable. Maybe it means having some kind of specialty vehicle. I know some districts are exploring the idea of like separate vans or small fleet vehicles that might be able to do pickups after the sort of standard bus route runs. So in general, transportation is really expensive, as I think you know, Kate, and is logistically complex. So it's an area that's a good example of a place where I would personally be really interested in seeing more research and potentially pilot studies, demonstration studies to look at impact evaluations. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, turns out Texas does not have a lot of walkable communities. So, yes, very familiar with the transportation game. Thank you guys so much. Great work, great research. Thanks for all of this.
Thank you, Kate. Do we have time for more audience questions, Karen?
Yeah, I think we can take one more. It looks like Brianna's raising her hand.
Yes. Hi, my name is Brianna. I'm the policy associate at the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis in Richmond, Virginia. And my question was focused on like if and how school policies are addressing concerns of immigration enforcement. So for instance, are there examples of schools that have policies where if there is a concern about immigration enforcement, that counts as an excused absence, or there are like instances where a certain number of unexcused absences counts as truancy. So if it's not counted as an excused absence, could there be like grace given for like families that do have concerns over immigration enforcement and absences from schools?
Yeah, I think one thing I know my co-authors can offer a little bit more detail about how the particular Liberty City School District is handling this. But one thing to consider is that a lot of times districts don't have a lot of latitude in our data system, in our setting. There are like pre-specified codes that they have to stick to, and the state is pretty rigorous, and like you have to use this code if it's these reasons. So one recommendation that we have is that if these continue, the state education agencies should think about expanding how they allow districts to report attendance, so that these absences that are not caused by anything the district can control do not count against that district in terms of some accountability metrics.
And to add to that, it's beyond the impact on the school district in terms of absences. What we would really hate to see is for families to be penalized, to be sent to truancy court because their children have been absent from school because of immigration enforcement activity. That would put them at greater risk of detention and deportation for them to be already involved in the court system. And so something that we are starting to explore is what would it look like for schools and for state education agencies to provide an option for an absence to be excused based on ICE activity in the local area.
Yeah, and I'll just add, one of the things that the district is asking us to do is try to collect data so they could go to the state education agency and say, we feel like this share of our absences is due to this new regime or to this shift. Now, I also want to know, some of the practices that they've tried to implement to get ahead of some of this, is that they've implemented a much more, I would argue, humane truancy court policy where instead of having families have to go to the courthouse or to go downtown, they're actually bringing the family court magistrate to the school setting to kind of lower the anxiety associated with the truancy process. The other thing is that they've tried policies around, and this was, I think, true following what was happening in Minnesota, but the cone policy of trying to signal to families and students if there has been an immigration enforcement action in the last 24 hours, we want to communicate that in a covert way to folks. And so these kind of call them guerrilla tactics are things that many districts around the country, I think, are trying to try for their families.
Costa, I'm going to cut you off because we are 1 minute past the hour, actually. And I feel like a lot of us could go on and continue discussing this. This has been such a great discussion. We so much appreciate all of you, Tom, the authors, and all of you who stayed to the end of this and allowed us to really get deep into this topic. Please take our feedback survey. This will let us get better at what we do. And the very last thing to say for those of you who are still here is that this was the winner of our vote in terms of which webinar we did, but we had some other papers that we're pulling together, and we will be sending out virtual conversations that we're having with those authors and some of the other topics that didn't win this sort of top vote for the next Ed Working Paper webinar. So keep your eye on your inbox for those, and thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.